Thanks for the invitation. I'm happy to be here. I want to emphasize the subheading of my talk. All beekeepers can be involved. And this presentation is for all beekeepers, not just for queen producers. I'll begin with a brief history of Varroa-resistant hygiene, VSH. Roger Hoopengarner, Jeff Harris, and I discovered the VSH trait in 1995. We first called it SMR, which stood for suppressed mite reproduction, because colonies with this trait had very low mite populations, and when we found mites in the brood, they were not producing any progeny. So it seemed to us that the bees were causing the mites to be non-reproductive. But we didn't understand how it worked. A break came in 2004 in a telephone call from Marla Spivak at the University of Minnesota. We had shared the SMR stock with her. She said that she and her graduate student, Abdullah Ibrahim, thought that the mechanism of resistance of SMR was a form of hygienic behavior, the removal of Varroa-infested brood cells. I was skeptical because we had seen no correlation between our Varroa resistance and the freeze-kill test for hygiene. But we learned that they were right. So we changed the name from SMR, suppressed mite reproduction, to VSH, Varroa sensitive hygiene. Worker bees destroy brood cells if they are infested with a mite. But while we were testing that, we learned a critical detail. If a cell contained a mite that had not produced progeny, that cell was not disturbed. So the bees weren't causing the mites to be non-reproductive. It just seemed that way because they were removing the cells containing reproductive mites, the mites that had progeny. My goal is twofold today. First, I want to explain how VSH controls mites. VSH is a trait, like body color. It's not a line or a breed. It can be added to any bee population. Compare adding Varroa resistance to your bee population to replacing an old sofa in your house. Do you buy a house that has a new sofa? Of course not. Just get a new sofa. Likewise, when we want to add VSH alleles to our bee population, we don't need to change the bee population. We just need to add the VSH trait. My first objective is to explain how the VSH trait controls Varroa. Secondly, I'm going to teach you all how to measure the VSH trait. You can measure VSH as soon as 6 weeks after introducing a new queen. That gives you peace of mind if your colony has a good score, or advanced notice if your score is poor. In the latter case, you can take steps to save the colony before there's a crisis. Also, beekeepers can evaluate their colonies to see if they need a VSH queen. And if you buy a Varroa-resistant queen, you can check to see if the queen really is resistant to Varroa.
Hey, John.
Yeah.
Are we on the right slide?
Yeah, we still are.
Okay, great. Just making sure.
I had this preliminary stuff. So
you're great. All good.
Thanks. Thanks. I have in my rehearsals, I did forget to change the slide a couple of times, so we're good.
All right, perfect. Continue.
So far. Anyway, probably 90% of you already have the equipment needed to measure the VSH trait. You need a good light, magnification of 3 or 4x, and a focal distance of at least 4 inches, because you need to use your hands between your microscope or magnifier and the brood comb that's being examined. If you have a cell phone, you have what you need. Cell phones also have a built-in bright light that's in a perfect position next to the lens. with the bonus of having zoom magnification and autofocus. My experience has been limited to the magnify utility on an iPhone SE, but all iPhones, iPads seem to have the magnify utility, and I understand that Android phones do also. Here's where we're going this morning. I'm going to discuss how VSH controls Varroa. Then I'll explain how you can measure VSH in your bees. I will skip many of the details about scoring and recording VSH. So if and when you evaluate your bees, you can go to our website, harbobeco.com, to get detailed information about measuring, scoring, and recording Varroa-sensitive hygiene. Avoid needless work. I have a few common ideas that I hear that you may want to reconsider. Then I'm going to go to the unique benefits offered by natural mating and by artificial insemination. And lastly, where do you fit in? The bee breeder, queen producer, the hobby beekeeper will all benefit from the ability to measure VSH, but in different ways. I'm going to start by explaining the reproductive cycle of Varroa and how the VSH trait figures into it. This diagram describes the time in days of Varroa's reproductive cycle. In worker brood, mites reproduce in drone brood too, but we'll address that later. The top line of numbers 1 through 12 represent the number of days that mites spend in worker brood, entering, as the arrow shows, just before the cell is capped. Once the cell is capped, the mite is trapped. She couldn't get out if she wanted to. We call the mite that enters the cell the foundress, or the foundress female. Her plan is to produce as many offspring as possible within the next 12 days. Now, the numbers 1 through 7 represent the time that mites spend on adult bees before they re-enter a brood cell. It's called the phoretic phase. The average time spent on adult bees is variable, but 7 days is common. Generally, there's about 2/3 of the mites exist in the brood of the total population, and 1/3 is in the phoretic stage at any given time in a normal bee colony. After the cell is capped, and after the host larva has eaten the rest of the brood food and spun her cocoon, the foundress lays the first of what will be about 5 eggs, about 30 hours apart. The first egg is a male, and the remainder are females. On day 12, when the host, the worker bee, emerges from her cell, the reproductive phase for the mite comes to an end. The foundress and her adult female progeny emerge from the cell to spend time on adult bees, and the cycle continues. The adult male and the adult female and the non-adult females, the immatures, cannot live outside the cell, so they all perish. Adult female Varroa are the only mites that live outside the brood cell. Worker bees with the VSH trait disrupt the mite reproduction cycle right in those 2 days where it's red. The bees detect Varroa infested cells and remove or cannibalize the soft-bodied bee. After the bee pupa in the cell is destroyed, the foundress female escapes to an unknown fate, and her progeny all perish. This is how Varroa-sensitive hygiene controls mite population. It stops mite reproduction. So worker bees with the VSH trait break the reproductive cycle of Varroa at only one place, but that is enough. Therefore, when measuring Varroa-sensitive hygiene, we look for evidence of what happened at that vulnerable point by examining older brood that has passed through that vulnerable segment. Now the sampling. Here is a dissecting scope setup. I'll show a cell phone setup next. I collect a comb that has some worker pupae that are at least 7 days post-capping, purple-eyed pupae or older, and I collect it from about 9 colonies at a time. So I don't need to go back and forth to the apiary. It takes about 20 minutes to examine 100 cells. I use 4x magnification and a bright light. I uncap a cell with a sharp forceps, like you see in the figure, and then I remove the pupa and check her for mites on her and in her cell. I use a container at the right to hold any young bees here, young bees that emerge while I'm working. The container has a ring of Vaseline near the top to keep those bees from crawling out. If you're using a dissecting scope, you probably want to reduce the magnification. A 0.5 objective reduces the magnification with this scope from 7 to 3.5, but equally important here, it increases the depth of field and the focal distance, the distance between the scope and the comb, giving you more room for your hands and a better angle for the illumination to reach the base of the cell. Here's the cell phone setup. Quite simple. Set the phone on a horizontal support that leaves the phone 7 or 8 inches above the tabletop. I use rubber bands and a piece of wood to attach the wood to a support, but any sturdy horizontal support will work. The autofocus on the phone is good in some ways, but it becomes a problem when you want to focus on the contents at the bottom of the cell. If you tilt the comb up to get a better view and a better focus at the base of the cell, the autofocus moves up too, keeping the focus on the surface of the comb rather than where you want it. To solve that problem, use the focus lock feature. Focus on the surface of the comb where you would examine the pupa that is removed, and then press the focus lock and leave it there. That way, when you lift the comb, tilt the comb forward to examine material at the base of the cell, you'll move into better focus. So this is the image you can get, and I'm about 2/3 as powerful as I can get. This is how you adjust the magnification. So as you can see, you get a pretty good view of the bottom of the cell, and we'll return to that in a bit. For uncapped cells, I mentioned that I check only worker cells that are 7 to 11 days post-capping. In other words, the older brood. Here are 4 uncapped cells. The first one is much too young. That's this one. The second one is probably 6 days post-capping. The 7-day post-capping will have this same body color, but it'll have purple eyes. So as a rule of thumb, anything purple-eyed or older is no longer post removal stage. So you can examine those for this test. One can evaluate pupae It's purple-eyed, aged, and older. I guess I already said that. Third example is a pupa that's 9 to 10 days old. Of course, that's fine too. There's the older one. The last one, the last one is too old, I think. She has shed her pupal skin and examined and expanded her wings. So she's an adult. One can evaluate this stage, but I don't. There's too much moving around in that cell. Next is to look at the mites in the cell. The pupa on the left has been uncapped. She's old enough to examine. So we'll pretend like we're examining her. You pull the bee out and you look on the bee because sometimes the mites are on the bee. But generally, you'll see if there's a reproductive mite, you'll see a fecal patch near the base of the cell at about a 2 o'clock or 9 o'clock or 2 o'clock or 10 o'clock location. See, this one's about at 10 o'clock. And that one is about 10 o'clock. Those are the fecal patch. That's the feces that the mite leaves. The top is a typical reproductive cell. And here is the foundress female. And here's our male. And then the immatures are protonymph, deutonymph. They have 2 stages of development after the egg. The egg is, this one has an example of an egg. They're pretty good sized. This mite is probably about ready to become an adult. So anyway, this is a reproductive cell. This is the larval skin of the bee. It's going to always be there. It has nothing to do with the mites. I'll show you better pictures of those later. So this cell is reproductive. This one is kind of reproductive, but we don't call it that. She is a female with an egg only. There's the fecal patch and the larval skin. So cells with reproducing mites are obvious, whereas cells with non-reproducing mites or a dead mite are easy to miss. This one isn't really either one. This is non-viable because it has an egg only, and an egg at this stage does not have time to reach adulthood. Sometimes these non-viable cells have an egg and also a male. The cell is reproductive but non-viable. I count it as non-reproductive because there may have been no progeny a few days earlier when the cell was within the vulnerable period for Varroa removal. So if there's no fecal patch, there's usually no mite, but that isn't always the case. A single foundress is hard to spot against a dark cell wall, so non-reproducing mites are easily missed, but don't stress too much about that. We all miss finding the mite. The main thing is don't miss finding the reproductive mites. So when you finish your count of 100 cells, which is what I'm going to propose, you can use a scoring chart on my website. If you find more than 5 Varroa cells as you're counting, you can quit even before you reach 100 because that colony is not going to have any of the VSH trait. The scoring table on the website will give you a VSH estimate whether or not you miss a non-reproductive mite. But finding reproductive mites is the most important. But it's nice to be able to find the non-reproductives. It makes it more confident that you have the VSH trait. Okay, here's looking at a cell phone view. In the previous slide, you saw the contents of 2 Varroa infested cells. Here are cells that are not infested. 10 cells have been uncapped. 4 on the left and 3 on the right. Here's the ones on the left. The white material at the bottom of the cell is the shed larval skin. See that one and that one and that one. Not to be mistaken for a fecal patch. None of those cells were mite infested. 3 cells that are still occupied by bee pupae are purple-eyed, just old enough to evaluate. So if there's no fecal patch on the cell wall, there are usually no mites in the cell. However, infertile mites often place their fecal patch on the bee, commonly on the abdomen, like this one, rather than on the cell wall. Sometimes the mite feces are scattered on the pupae. I don't know what causes the mite to change the placement of feces from the cell wall to the bee's body. The only time I see it, though, is when the mite does not produce progeny. I'll let you look at this picture for a minute before we talk, because otherwise there's a lot of stuff going on. This is time, 7 days, then the removal period. I mean 3 days post-capping and then 7 days post-capping. This is a before and after picture. The columns on the left represent Varroa infestation before the brood enters the vulnerable stage. Note that in this example, about 12% of the mites that enter the cell did not produce progeny. That's pretty typical. It's a ratio of about 1 to 7. 7 bees that are reproductive, 7 mites that are reproductive, and 1 that is not. We don't need to know the initial mite infestation, but we do know that less than 20% of them will have non-reproductive mites. So when we look at cells 7 days post-capping, and if we find that all of the infested cells have non-reproducing mites, we conclude that the colony has all of the VSH alleles. In this example, all reproductive mites have been removed, so that the only infested cells that remain are the ones that had no progeny. That's full expression of the VSH trait, or a score of 4. The point here is, the only data we have is right here. That's the only thing we've collected. We don't bother looking at what the infestation was beforehand. So that's all we need. We do not need to estimate the mite population before. The non-reproducing mites serve as our constant. Here's another example, same idea. But this is a scenario that has worker bees that have about half of the VSH alleles, such as when a VSH queen free mates with drones that do not carry VSH alleles. So the colony has half of the VSH trait, or half of the alleles, the additive alleles for VSH. Again, the only measurement that you have is the one taken from older brood. That's all we need. This is what you should expect if you purchase a free-mated VSH queen. This is a significant level of mite removal, enough to control mites. They went from a ratio of 1 to 7 to a ratio of 1 to 2. So the VSH trait is additive. So even with a little bit of the trait, you do get some resistance. I have a scoring chart that I mentioned before and would give you a score of 2 on a scale of 0 to 4. This would be a score of 2. But if you had not found a non-reproductive mite, you would still get a score of 2, because the chart scores it either way. With, if you don't find a VSH any non-reproducing mites, or if you do. Now we're going to the reproductive cycle again. After introducing a new queen, how soon can a colony be scored? The answer is 6 weeks, but to be conservative, I recommend 7 weeks. Why so long? Because only adult workers express VSH, and it is at least 20 days before a queen produces her first worker. So there's 20. A few very young worker bees probably would not express VSH, so it's best to wait at least 15 more days so that a large proportion of the workers and all of the young workers are progeny of the new queen. So add 15. Then it takes 5 more days for those vulnerable cells to progress into the older brood that we choose to evaluate, those that are 7 to 11 days post-capping. That adds another 5 days. That adds up to 40. 40 days is the absolute minimum, starting from the time a queen begins to lay eggs in the colony. During those 40 days, a mite population will continue to grow. So if you look for mites on adult bees within 40 days after introducing a queen whose progeny has a very high level of VSH, you would be disappointed. So don't look. But after 40 days, the mite population begins to decline because mites have a reproductive cycle of about 20 days. It takes 15 more days, or a total of 55 days, for the entire mite population to be exposed to that vulnerable segment in their reproductive cycle. So if you evaluate mite populations by sampling mites on adult bees, need to wait at least 60 days, right? No, that's not long enough. Recall, when the bees disrupt mite reproduction, the foundress is not killed. She is prematurely returned to the phoretic state and adds to the number of mites on adult bees. So we end up with most of the adult mites on adult bees, whereas normally an infested colony has 2/3 of the population in the brood cells. How long does a displaced foundress stay on adult bees? Does she re-enter a cell and try again? How long does she live? VSH produces a situation where most of the mite population is suddenly on the adult bees rather than in the brood. We don't know all those details about how long they live and if she re-enters the cell, when. But the bottom line is this. If we base our breeding decisions on the number of mites on adult bees, we may be selecting for Varroa susceptibility and against resistance with VSH. That's all I have on measuring and scoring VSH. Now I've got 5 things about avoid needless work. I'm going to go through them. First one, I never sample adult bees for mites. If there are no mites in the brood, the mite population can only decline, and I don't need to know how many mites are present on adult bees. Second, the VSH trait does not seem to control mites in drone brood as it does in worker brood. That has not been a problem for me, though, so I leave drones alone. I don't take them out and freeze them or anything like that. Number 3, don't let a Varroa susceptible colony die from Varroa. By measuring VSH in a colony as early as possible, you can identify a susceptible colony and take steps to avoid losing the bees long before damage is done. Number 4, I don't evaluate a colony more than once. As long as a colony has the same queen, the VSH score should not change. If you're not satisfied with your results, you can inoculate the colony with a frame of newly capped worker brood from a colony that has mites, and then evaluate the brood on that frame exactly 7 days later. Lastly, I often hear people say that they plan to combine VSH with another mite-resistant trait. That's really not necessary because VSH doesn't need another trait to make it Varroa resistant. Moreover, a simple crossing of two different traits, such as a mating queens with trait A to drones with trait B, would result in both traits becoming less effective. So don't do that. Besides, assembling full expression of two traits in one queen is many times more difficult than assembling one. Now the survivor approach. The live or let die approach and breeding from survivors is nature's way. And I respect nature. But we have the power of the single drone insemination. Nature doesn't. There's a lot of genetic variation within a colony when a queen is naturally mated with multiple drones that come from who knows where. Free mated queens end up having half the neighborhood represented in one colony. How can I breed from that? That will not enable me to detect a trait that may be universally present at, let's say, 10% frequency. Single drone inseminations produce genetic uniformity within each test colony and reveal genetic differences between colonies. The best way to detect and recover genetic variation in a group of colonies is to inseminate each queen with semen from a single drone. We used that approach in 1995, set up an experiment with 43 colonies, each with a queen inseminated with a single drone. 2 months later, we identified the VSH trait in 3 of the colonies. If we had relied on natural mating, we'd still be looking. Free mating is important, just not useful in selective breeding. The benefit of natural mating is its role in drone selection. When collecting drones for artificial insemination, we unfortunately choose a colony with a high-scoring queen. We then take every drone, unfortunately, that we can catch. So we bypass the benefit of within-colony competition, drone competition, that nature uses so well. I estimate that fewer than 1% of the drones successfully mate with a queen. And those that do are probably those that are not diseased, are not parasitized by, by Varroa during their development, have strong and well-functioning bodies, but probably most importantly, they're competing in all 3 of those challenges with only one set of chromosomes. So they're very vulnerable to genetic imperfection. So when successful in mating, a drone transfers identical copies of his winning gamete to a queen. Thus, natural mating maintains the quality of our bee populations and may also support Varroa resistance, as long as the drone source colonies are not treated to control mites. Because the VSH trait is not restricted to any bee population, we can use natural mating to refresh our stock. Allow some VSH queens to free mate, and if you like what you see, add the best ones to your breeding population. For when you know how to measure VSH, a high level of VSH can always be restored. So if you discover that your best breeder queen has been superseded, think of it as an opportunity to refresh your stock. So what's in it for you? Checking 100 cells of worker brood enables a beekeeper to predict a colony's Varroa status at an early stage, 7 weeks though. But before there's a crisis, whether you're a beginner or a seasoned beekeeper, you will benefit from the ability to measure VSH in your bees. There are different strategies for different situations. If you have the ability to use artificial insemination, you have many options. The VSH trait is probably present in bee populations worldwide. So one option is to find the trait yourself. The buckfast breeders in the Netherlands did that. So now they have VSH resistance in the buckfast bees. A simpler solution is to get a queen that has a VSH trait and take it from there. One is all you need. Remember, this is a trait, not a line or a breed. Your colonies supply the supporting cast. If you are a queen producer who does not have artificial insemination capability, need to get a breeder queen. Here's where your ability to measure VSH comes in handy. You can measure the progeny of the breeder queen. Again, you have to wait 7 weeks though, to see if it scores at least a 3. If not, you should inform the person who produced it. You may also want to measure and score VSH in some of the colonies produced by your free-mated daughter queens. If you have had VSH breeders in the previous years, you may find high levels of VSH in some of those colonies. And maybe after about a few years of breeder queens, you may reach a point where you have an adequate level of VSH in your bees, enabling you to select your own breeder queens. If you're a sideliner, a hobby beekeeper, or a beginner with one hive, and you don't want to expose them, your bees, the honey, or your bee equipment to toxic materials, buy free-mated VSH queens. Don't waste your money on a breeder queen. After you get those queens established, measure and score their progeny. They should score at least a 1 or a 2. If you get a 0, you are entitled to a replacement or refund. If you get a 2 or better, congratulate the seller. Your ability to measure the quality of your queens makes you a better consumer and improves the industry. When you order, you may want to tell the seller that you measure VSH in your colonies and that you would be happy to provide feedback if that would be helpful to them. When consumers know how to measure Varroa resistance in their colonies, queen producers will take notice. That's all I have for today. I have detailed information about measuring VSH, printed scoring charts, and record-keeping examples are all posted on our website, harbobeco.com. The website also has information about our VSH co-op. It started in 2020 with a group of queen producers who share a common interest in producing and retaining Varroa resistance and sharing bees. Thank you for watching.